First of all, thank you, Sheilagh, for an amazing talk yesterday and a very interesting masterclass today that went really into serfdom. I learned a lot. This is the final part of this sort of official part, and which is the interview. So I'm Felix, Max Weber Fellow in the Department of Economics and SPS, and Deirdre is also Max Weber Fellow at the Robert Schumann Center. So we are having around about 45 minutes. We want to talk about two things with you. One is research, and the other one is Sheilagh's production function.
Okay. Otherwise known as life.
Exactly, otherwise known as life. And so I just start with the topic that I hope it's fair to say that in economic history, probably most people know you for these little nice associations called guilds. You wrote two very well-known books on it, and the question I was wondering is, did you feel you said everything about guilds, or are there still topics that you would want to tackle, maybe things that unanswered questions, or is this something where you say I said it all, what I had to say?
I think I now know more things that we need to know about guilds than I did when I first started working on them. So I think the answer is we're not finished. I hope that my two books, which were on, one of them on merchant guilds, which have particular characteristics because they have to deal with problems of long distance trade, and then craft guilds or guilds of local service and industrial providers. The 2019 book, that those were both basically restricted to Europe and the Mediterranean. And one of the things which we now need to know a lot more about, or we already needed to know a lot more about it, are guilds in the rest of the world. Because one thing that I did for the 2019 book was to make the database that I used, which had, 17,000 observations, freely available online. And one of the reasons was that I wanted people who were working on guilds in other world societies to use it and add to it and use it as a framework for comparison. So I think one of the things that I would really like to see over the coming years is more work on the guilds, especially of the Middle East. I gave a talk at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies about this time last year, and I said, well, I don't know anything about Islamic guilds, and the director said, neither does anyone else. So before the talk, I kind of looked again at the little that we know, and I tried to connect, European guilds with Islamic guilds. And there's a widely held view inside Middle Eastern history that, maybe the Middle East was economically backward because it didn't have enough guilds. And I said, actually, I don't think so. I think if the Middle East had had more guilds, it would have been even worse. But we need to know much more about how guilds worked in the Islamic world or in the Middle East more generally. The relationship with religious law and with the state and with religious organizations and with charity in the Middle East. There were guilds in parts of Africa. There were guilds in Latin America, and that leads me to the second thing, which I hope will be a really big growth area over the coming years, which is one of my graduate students last year who actually won our divisional dissertation prize, had a background in computer science, but also spoke and read Spanish very well. He read a corpus of 52 Latin American guild ordinances from 16th through 18th century Peru and Mexico, using OCR into a database. And then he used machine learning approaches and AI to develop topic clusters and to analyze the vocabulary and parts of speech and the clusters of ways in which people referred to particular aspects of the behavior of guilds. And he found that this transplanted European institution took very different forms in two different Latin American countries across these 3 centuries, and also developed in different ways. So they emphasized, he was actually using the the topics that in my 2019 book. So he's looking at entry barriers, human capital, investment, quality controls, the welfare and religious activities of guilds. And he found that the Peruvian and the Mexican guild systems worked differently from the beginning and developed differently over time. And his argument was that they fit into the existing institutional structure in those two New World societies in different ways. And that was just one example of what someone could do in 1 year. This was a 1-year master's dissertation. There are hundreds of guild ordinances, which from many different countries, including, as you can see, from non-European countries, which could be analyzed in a similar way. And I think one of the things which I would love to see is these legal and in some ways qualitative sources being analyzed in a more systematic way. I mean, I analyzed a series of German guild ordinances as a graduate student, but I had to read every word of them and code them myself. My student did it in 1 year, and did the whole analysis and developed the method, much more quickly, and did a really nice quantitative analysis. So I would love to see that happen. So I actually think there's so much more to do, both outside Europe and using new analytical techniques. I don't think guilds are dead.
I think you already almost answered the question.
You anticipated us.
She anticipated us, yes.
Yes, I basically had a tack follow-up to Felix's question on guilds about the work that you did with that database, but I think you have covered that. Is there anything else you'd like to say more about how scholars should position themselves in this moment where there is emerging AI and emerging tech? And also, how do you see AI as changing the field of economic history?
I think it really is. It's a huge growth area, and we have started having more papers in our seminar series where people have used that. We have students who are using it to look at many different aspects of, more traditional economic history, like financial history and so on. But I think that some of it is just curiosity. I mean, as soon as ChatGPT was released, within like 3 weeks, our students were using it. So they, the economic historians, they like that sort of thing. In fact, probably everyone likes that sort of thing, jumped in. But now we're sort of in the second year of that, and it's informing the dissertations of people. I think it's incredibly positive. So, but there are ways in which I would like to see it being directed, or not directed, but guided. It's very positive because, especially for societies for which there aren't a lot of quantitative sources that are already, there, so you can use AI to read in existing quantitative sources and format them and get them into an Excel file and then, read that Excel file into Stata and start doing your normal econometrics. But you can also take, as I was just mentioning, qualitative sources, verbal, word, baskets of words, bags of words, and start analyzing them in various ways. And it isn't just, does it mention witchcraft or women or labor coercion or whatever it is you're interested in, but does it mention them positively or negatively? So when the occurrence of the word serfdom or the word guild or the word freedom or the word woman takes place in a document, it is the cloud of words around that positive or negative ones. So you can do much more than has been done so far, and I think that's gradually happening. But there are corpuses of legal documents like guild ordinances, and there's a huge database of the case law of England, which we heard a really brilliant paper on in our seminar the day before. In fact, I stayed the night before coming to Florence in order to listen to that paper. That tens of thousands of English cases which are being used by the scholars in order to test hypotheses about whether the institutional basis or the financial basis of English society changed fundamentally in 1688, as is often argued by, economic historians, or whether actually there were changes that took place earlier or changes that took place later, or whether it wasn't a monotonic change. So you can use print culture corpuses in order to see, do the laws reflect the same discontinuities as print culture more generally? But you can also, I'm thinking about the ways in which some of my favorite sources on aspects of economies that are never quantified, especially, for instance, the work I've done on the economic position of women, which is worth studying for its own sake, since 50% of us are female, but it's also important for economic development more generally, because a lot of work on the less developed world nowadays suggests that the position of women is really important for development outcomes. And yet they're so invisible in quantitative sources, tax registers. At best you will have in Western Europe, 10 to 20% of household taxpayers, which are female. In Eastern Europe, it will be 5% usually. But, there's a lot of women who, never married. They weren't widows. They didn't have their own households. And yet we want to know what their activities were. How were their property rights? What kind of work did they do? Were they in the labor market? Were they only working in the household? What's the spatial, distribution of their activities? Did they do skilled work, or are the sort of theories about how well, women's reproductive responsibilities mean that they couldn't learn skills? Is women's low upper body strength something which means that they couldn't do heavy work? There's all sorts of testable hypotheses. We can't get at it usually by existing quantitative sources. You can get at it by using corpuses of text. And one of the book before the Guilds book, which was a book about women, markets, and social capital in early modern Germany, I read 7,000 handwritten pages of German legal court documents. So they were church court registers from 2 villages in Southwest Germany. I read them through twice and coded them. I extracted every observation of either women or men working. And I coded it about what kind of work, what sector of the economy it was in. Was it skilled or not skilled, or medium skilled? Did it involve heavy labor? Was it inside or outside the household? What was the marital status of the person? Were they in town or village? Everything that I could. And then I analyzed it, and I learned so much more. I was able to test hypotheses that are interesting to economic historians and development economists about patterns of women's work. And one of the things I found was that what determined the spatial distribution of women's work was not actually gender. It was your marital status. So married men worked inside the household more than unmarried women. For instance, women worked and did heavy labor. They did day laboring. They worked in agriculture. They worked in the market. So I think that, I had to read 7,000 handwritten pages. I did it once, and I thought, I just want to go back and check I did it right. So I did it again. But did snag a few little errors. So I was happy I'd done it. But I think that's a way in which text analysis and ChatGPT and automating reading the documents into digital form, but then analyzing them using some of those text analysis and topic analysis systems would enable us to do that, for more than 2 villages over a couple of 100 years. We could actually do it for any place that has qualitative sources. And, there are other projects looking at gender and work using the same methodology as I developed in 2003 that are doing it for the Scandinavian lands. So Maria Ogren and her group at Uppsala are doing that for Scandinavian gendered work patterns. Jane Whittle is doing it for England. And there's a new project starting up in Italy. Andrea Caracausi is sort of coordinating it in Padova. And he's doing it for Italian female work patterns, the first Southern European zone to be brought in. And that's going to be really important because there are quite strong theories that Northern Europe was different from and better than Southern Europe, partly because of the role that women played in the economy. I think we will now, in a couple of years' time, we will be able to test that because this is being done in Italy as well. So, I would see being able to use non-traditional sources and to use machine learning and to use, text analysis as a major way in which the new tech can help us.
Fantastic.
Sanju?
I have a new question.
Yeah.
Due to the current climate crisis, environmental history has become a particularly active area. And I'm interested, how do you see environmental and economic history interacting in the future? I'm particularly interested in asking this because environmental histories used to be seen as a bit reductive a few decades ago, and that has somewhat changed.
So reductive in the sense that it was focusing on sort of geography and nature.
Exactly.
And so on. I would see environmental history as a huge and very productive growth area, not just because it's happening, we're in it. It's not, global warming, but species, species that are disappearing, earthworms are disappearing, non-charismatic species. I like earthworms, but not everyone feels the same about worms. But I think more generally, there are both historical and economic tools that can be used in productive ways in combination with one another to look at environmental questions. And in the Max Weber lecture I gave here in Florence yesterday, which was about controlling contagion, about how human societies dealt with the recurrent pandemics that, the human populations have experienced since between the Black Death and COVID. I think we saw one of the ways in which it's important to look at the organization of our own societies. We're not just interacting with the natural world as individuals. When I get COVID, obviously it's me versus the COVID virus. But actually, one of the reasons that when I get COVID, I don't die of it now is because of the way that my society responded during COVID, first with non-pharmaceutical interventions, and then very happily through immunization. And so I think that the same analytical tools and historical tools that we use to think about one natural shock, namely our encounter with the microbial world, can be used also to think about environmental issues, because some of the same problems arise. In fact, the concept, very basic economic concept of the externality. We do things as individuals which may cause a few costs for ourselves, but they also have spillover. I, as an individual, will do something like, polluting my environment, which causes some costs for me, but it also causes spillover costs for the environment that I don't have to pay for. And that was actually the context within which the idea of externalities first became known, was pollution, destroying the environment. If I don't pay for what I do, I'm going to do more of it than society would ideally like me to do. And conversely, the concept of the positive externality, climate mitigation, that's an example where by doing fewer things that cause global warming, I am I'm benefiting myself. Both I feel happier if I do that, but also I feel that I will benefit if the globe does not warm. But I'm also creating benefits for the rest of humanity, and yet I'm not being rewarded for that. The only reward I get is that I feel that I've behaved in a proper way. That's not usually sufficient. And so the concept of how do you reward people for engaging in mitigation, and how do you impose some costs on them for engaging in things that cause global warming, for instance, or cause environmental damage. The concept of the positive and negative externality, basic economic concepts, very useful. We can look further back in history and see that communities and states and other entities were already trying to deal with these environmental issues quite far back. The concept of public goods, you know, setting up a sanitary system, for instance, or a factory emissions regulation system, those have very powerful public good characteristics, non-rival, non-excludable. Again, there are ways in which we can use basic economic reasoning, but also look at the long historical record and look at the competing solutions which different societies have arrived at for dealing with, you know, there have been recurrent climatic fluctuations. There was the little ice age. There, you know, further back in history, there have been huge climate fluctuations that, you know, killed a lot of people. How did those societies that emerged from them, you know, how were they resilient? How did they survive this? Was there some way in which they engaged in mitigation activities? So I think those are ways in which I would see environmental history going. And I kept on thinking about this while writing the Contagion book, because I was thinking a lot of what I'm writing here, you could actually apply to environmental history.
Yeah, I was thinking this too during your lecture yesterday. Thank you.
Completely different question about something that you are maybe not such an expert on. Canada. You worked most of your life on Europe, but you're Canadian. What are the most interesting topics in Canadian economic history?
Well, I have to make a little confession, which was my very first book, which is just a little book, is about Canadian history. And it was about the preservation of the Canadian bison, the buffaloes, the huge sort of herds of ungulates that roamed across the western parts of North America before we came in, or our ancestors came in and wiped them out, basically. So this was the result of a summer job I had when I was an undergraduate. The National and Provincial Parks Association of Canada paid my salary for 2 months, for 2 summers to research and write this little book. And it paid for a couple of years of university for me, which was nice. But it also resulted in this little book. So it was more a popular book. So it was trying to explain what had happened and who did it, and how I didn't even know the word state capacity in those days, but the way in which the initiatives of individuals who were actually just doing it out of philanthropy. They were doing it because they wanted to make the world better. So they were getting a sort of inner benefit, but they were not being rewarded for it. Interacted with state regulation and the park system, the national park system, and so on, to save some of the last herds before they were wiped out, and also to keep the wood bison and the sort of western bison apart, so that we still have the 2 species, because otherwise they would have got mixed. And we wouldn't still have those 2 species. So I think environmental history, again, is something where we would, you know, the positive externalities of saving species is something. But, you know, the permafrost is melting in northern Canada. The things that you can grow, I mean, you know, global warming is going to affect not just southern nations, but also northern nations. And Canada has a huge frozen zone, which is being affected already. It's changing indigenous culture. It's changing the things that you can do with the land. Feral pigs are roaming around on the prairies, which they weren't in my childhood. So there's a lot of, you know, environmental change which is happening. I think that is likely to be a growth area in Canadian economic history. But the other thing about Canada is, of course, it's got 2 cultures in it. It's got a French-speaking culture and an English-speaking one. And, you know, there have been difficulties in that relationship, but actually they've got smaller over time. All sides have learned to mediate between their different languages and preferences and interests. And given that there are a lot of multicultural societies, either because of immigration or because the land boundaries were drawn by colonial rulers in Africa, not in the 19th century, not paying attention to where linguistic or tribal boundaries ran. It seems likely that there are going to be societies that have to deal with the peaceful coexistence of different languages and different cultures. And, I don't want to be triumphalist at all, but, I would be happy, even if Canada were not my own country, I would feel happy about a country that managed, to mediate and negotiate those relationships between large linguistic and sort of cultural groups. I think looking at the way in which French-speaking Canada developed in different and similar ways, maybe looking at the French-speaking groups that are not just in Quebec, but also parts of my family now live, although I grew up out west, now live in New Brunswick, where there is a very big Acadien group that speak French. It's a different kind of French.
Yes, it is. I went to school there.
Yeah, but there's a different way of the two cultures living side by side and relating with one another, and looking at both the way it worked in New Brunswick and also in Quebec. There's super interesting work that's being done on the way that the seigneurial system, the French seigneurial system, survived in Quebec and had, economic effects. And of course, England didn't really have a seigneurial system, and it certainly wasn't replicated in English-speaking Canada. So I think looking at different trajectories of agricultural development in the different parts of Canada. And then I suppose the third growth area would be Canada is an immigrant society. Even when I went to school, probably more than half of the kids that were in my class at school spoke a different language at home, which I was incredibly envious of. And they had this superpower. And, I was in the WASP minority. I mean, it wasn't really a minority, but it was definitely, I felt very disadvantaged. It's so hard to learn other languages. And so looking at what happens, from an economic historian's point of view, how do immigrant groups or immigrant individuals and families change when they come to a new society? A lot of the evidence we have suggests that they do change to become more like the recipient society, but they don't change all the way. And so the question is, I think we can use places like Canada to investigate the relative roles of the constraint structure of society and the cultural socialization that you were equipped with, whether you want it or not, by your parents and the people around you when you're growing up. How does that work out for not just for individuals, but for whole communities, and how they fit into a new society, or indeed bring new insights, making that society more innovative and have different solutions. For instance, to questions of how do we look after elderly people? Our economies are aging. There are different ways of looking after the elderly. Other cultures may have, different solutions which could work better than the purely, going into an old people's home model that we have. So, I think all immigrant societies are obviously very interesting, but Canada is sort of one par excellence, and that I would see that as a growth area.
Yes. And I would agree with you as well on the politically and socially positive aspects. It's not possible to imagine the FLQ crisis happening now, for instance.
I'm so glad to hear you say that, because that's what I think.
Yes.
But, I would like to know how did that happen?
Good question.
Was it, I think it was goodwill on both sides.
Yeah.
I remember being very moved to hear about a gigantic demonstration of Anglophone Canadians who marched to Ottawa to say, Quebec, we love you, stay with us. So, popular movements like that. But
you can imagine sort of violence happening after 95, and yet it didn't, right? And you can see the progress right there from the 70s into the 90s.
Yeah. So how did we do that? I mean, I don't feel that I contributed to it, apart from if I'd been in Canada, I would have been on that march. But, you know, what was it? Was it a cultural goodwill? Was it a political system that gave a little and took a little? Was it, you know, is there some way of mediating and managing?
Being reasonable.
Yeah. But being reasonable, does that come out of culture or does that come out of institutions?
That's a good question. And this has been a moment in Canadian history.
Yes, exactly.
I have to be the German and point out that we have 6 questions and
Okay.
in theory 9 minutes.
Okay,
So,
Right.
so it's,
do you want to go on with the next?
Sure, I'll make it quick.
Or we can run.
Mostly back to Europe. Economic history has often focused on winning nations like England, the United States, the Low Countries. You've chosen to work in less well-traveled territory historically, places such as Württemberg and the Czech lands. Where do you see economic history focusing in the years to come, in the decades to come? And I know you've touched on this already.
so my reason for wanting to study places that were, you know, were slow growing or even shrinking is partly because I went to university in Britain, so I know much more about British history and English history than, you know, that was what I was educated in, if you like. But it struck me that, especially because Britain was the first industrializing nation, everyone has their own favorite theory of the Industrial Revolution. But if you only know about Britain, what you focus on is, you know, what Britain did, but maybe it was partly what Britain didn't do.
Yeah.
And when I started studying Central Europe and Eastern Europe, I thought, this just wasn't happening in early modern England. Why was that? Maybe that was the reason, what part of the reason, one of the contributory factors to English and Dutch economic growth after 1500 was that not so much what they were doing, but what they weren't doing. So that was kind of what motivated me. And I think, you know, there are a lot of countries in the world, a lot of societies in the world. Maybe what we should be doing is not thinking they need to adopt Western institutions, but maybe they need, you know, if they're slow growing, they may want to say, what are we doing that we could take out, keep the strong parts of our society, but take out the bad bits? Because that was what the slow growing parts of Europe did. I mean, Württemberg is one of the richest parts of Germany now. And the question of how it made that transition from still being really poor and backward at the end of the 19th century to being where you would want to live in Germany now is a big question. What did they take out? They kept the strong bits of German society, the value for human capital, the entrepreneurship, you know, but they took out the bad bits. Maybe that's a path for development in the rest of the world.
Much to say about Württemberg as much. So we want to also know a little bit more about you as a person, not just as a scholar and as a thinker. And so this is our part on the Sheilagh Ogilvie reproduction function, or as you said, productive life. And the first question that I think will interest many members of the Max Weber program is, so the Max Weber program is a postdoctoral program. And I think what many of us observe or experience that once they get their PhDs published, maybe 1 or 2 papers, they have a sort of motivational dip. They lose a bit curiosity, and this is probably something that comes back over time with major achievements, maybe when one publishes an important book or gets a prestigious chair. So what I want to ask you is, did you experience motivational dips in your career where you, I don't know, lost your curiosity? And then most important thing, how did you get your curiosity and energy back? Or in other words, what's the secret source for your secret sauce for a fulfilling career?
That's a good question. I think I would have to say friendship is one of the things which meant that I never lost motivation, because if you develop a group of friends, even nowadays, you can actually keep. The problem with being an academic is that your friends move to other universities, but at least now you can go on talking to them and keep in touch with them. And one of the things that has meant that I didn't ever lose motivation was that my intellectual interests were embedded into my friendship group. And so the people that you know, even if you are feeling as if, you know, you've got incredibly heavy teaching load, you've changed institutions, everything's different, you don't know, you know, often I think the motivational dip is also you've changed the constraints within which you are operating. You're trying to work out a new set of constraints. Your friends will be at a different place in their lives, and they're still interested in all the things that you shared with them. And so you kind of replenish your spirit by talking to your friends about the things that matter. And connected with that, not all my friends are economic historians. They're, you know, they work in other social sciences. They might be pure historians, or they might be, you know, anthropologists or philosophers. But we share some fundamental interests, and we also, I think, share some fundamental questions about the organization of society. What's the position of universities and scholars in society? How can we contribute not just to our own careers, but also it would be nice to make our societies or the world a better place in the course of our careers. And I think, and not all of my friends are academics even. So, you know, I remember when I was 30, I got my first academic job, my full-time tenured academic job. My two very close female friends, one of them got a diplomatic job, working for the Danish Foreign Ministry, and one of them went into the private sector and was going to run her own business. And so we felt, here's three of us females, we're each 30, and we're going off in different directions. In 30 years, what will we have done? And so, you know, these are people I still know, they're still friends. And so, you know, we still care about similar things, but from our different specialisms. And I think maybe, as I say, friendship, sharing concerns, also having a life outside academia where you share fundamental interests, but you're not all in this same little claustrophobic space.
Competition.
Exactly. I have an ethics question.
Oh, yes.
As we've just said, academia is often a very competitive environment. And sometimes that competition has negative externalities on colleagues, on students, etc. And in addition, unethical behavior sometimes arises within academia. And I'm interested in, you are famous for having very high ethical standards, and I wanted to ask about how you maintain that over the course of your career.
Well, thank you for saying that. That's very nice. I think the thing that I often think, if I do observe unethical behavior, and actually I don't feel as if our discipline is, you know, sort of rotten to the core. I'm a bit worried about the replicability problem, which suggests that the incentives we have to, you know, publish in good journals and to get cool results could lead us to engage in p-hacking, you know, sort of emphasize cute findings over the many things that are completely negative. So, I mean, you know, you don't confirm a hypothesis, you don't falsify one, you just don't get any result. So I think, you know, there are incentives in the constraints that we face, which may cause, you know, especially young academics who have their way to make, to emphasize the nice things that come out of their data and kind of, you know, obscure the not so interesting one. And I actually think that that's probably, you know, that it's almost not, it's sort of on the borderline of being ethical. And sometimes I ask myself, well, okay, why do people do that? Because of course, if you work on something, you observe, you know, if you get into something, follow someone's steps, you see that they must have shaded their conclusions. And you ask yourself, would I have done that? How many colleagues would do that? And why? And I realized that it depends on whether you want success now or to be remembered in 20 or 30 or 50 years for having found something that is still true then, or useful then, sort of analytically interesting then. And I often say to students and postdocs, you know, you could make more money and be more successful either working for the government or working for the UN or the IMF or working in the private sector. Or working as a lawyer. I mean, we as economic historians are very much in demand in law. Lots of our students in Oxford go off to amazing law schools in the US, for instance. But you're not doing that. So ask yourself why you are in academia. Worldly success can't be the answer because you would earn more elsewhere. And you would have better secretarial support.
Yes.
So why are you in academia? You're in academia because you think that you're actually doing something which is, in a way, it's going to leave a legacy. Now, I think, you know, other walks of life, if you run an amazing company in the private sector, you've changed the world. If you are, you know, run the government well, or even contribute to the government well, or work in the UN or work for World Bank, you're also changing the world. But, you know, in academia, we actually think that maybe what we do now will still be being read and will illuminate scholars and maybe ordinary people in a generation or 2 generations. And you think of the people who did great work and you read them from the 18th century and the 19th century, and you think, man, that I would like to be remembered. And we had our Hicks lecturer this year in Oxford was Joel Mulcair, and he said, person that his hero was Edward Jenner, the guy who invented vaccination. That's, you know, it's feeling that, you know, Edward Jenner didn't even know that there were people like us who would be thinking, man, I wish I'd done that. And, you know, I will never invent a vaccination, but I hope the ideas and research I did will still be something that someone reads after I'm dead, preferably even while I'm still alive, and think, yes, that's right. That's good. And, you know, that's a reward that is very unique to scientists and scholars. And maybe that's something which young scholars should remember is, you know, you want to get rich, do something else. If you want to be remembered forever, do good work, even if it involves not getting into a top 5 firm.
It's wonderful. Thank you. I appreciate that. I've got a career question. You did this very unusual thing in your career. You got your PhD and you'd already had a lectureship at Cambridge. And then you went on for additional graduate study in economics at the University of Chicago. And I was wondering, was switching disciplines, was it very challenging? How did you deal with the math? And why did you do this? And what did it teach you?
Well, this question, it was actually one person that made this happen. It was an example of someone who wrote a book and didn't realize he was affecting unknown people elsewhere. I was in Heifers, which is the Cambridge bookshop, when I was in my last year as an undergraduate, and I came across a little book of essays by Gary Becker in Chicago called The Economic Approach to Human Behavior. An hour later, I was still standing there at that shelf reading, and it had all of these equations in it, and I couldn't understand. I mean, I could see they were calculus. Fortunately, I was educated in the Alberta school system, which is a pretty good, I mean, apparently educationalists worldwide say, what does Alberta do right?
The best in Canada.
Yeah, exactly. So I was incredibly lucky. And so I had a really great education, especially in math and the sciences. I did further math. So I could just about see that calculus and linear algebra were being used here. But it was the words, of course, that I understood. And I was standing there reading, transfixed by this new set of approaches and tools and concepts that I could absolutely see how you could apply it to 16th century villages. And I was thinking, man, I had no idea that this was what economists did. So I bought the book, which when you're an undergraduate is a big thing. And I took it home and I read it all the way through. And then I went back to the beginning and read it all the way through. And I thought, I need to learn economics. I need to be able to understand this. I want to apply, the household demand model to understanding fertility decisions in early modern European communities. I want to understand time allocation so that I understand why women are working or not working and switching between household and market. I want to understand why crime works the way it does, because sort of economics of crime, economics of time use, economics of religion. It was applying basic economic reasoning beyond the sort of financial and commercial sectors, which is kind of what I had up till then thought that economics was about. But I was in the British university system, and you can't switch. You're on the track. You're doing history. So I finished my degree, but I always thought I'm going to go and study. I'm going to do it. And so after I'd made my way as a doctoral student, and I did, what I had was actually, it was a research fellowship at Trinity College, and Trinity lets you take 2 years out in the middle of your 4-year research fellowship and have adventures in the rest of the world. And I said, can I go? Is it okay if my adventure is to study economics for 2 years? And they said, yeah, it's your 2 years. So I went out and I wrote to Gary Becker and I said, would you like to take me as a master's student? And he said, sure. So I went off and spent 2 years studying math a lot. The Canadian high school education, the Alberta high school education gave me just about enough math to make the transition, but you can never know enough math.
No.
So I spent 2 years every, 4 quarters. So I would spend, the summer learning more math and then go back in and use it in my coursework. But I also did write a dissertation with Gary. He supervised it. It was on women's work in early modern Germany, and it ultimately turned into my 2003 book. So it was very useful. So it was a wonderful experience. I have never had such, even though I've been at many amazing universities, and I think 2 years in Chicago, I just, the friends I made there were great. I still know them. We talked economics all the time. And most of them weren't economic historians, but it was a wonderful intellectual community. And I'm really happy I did it.
I think you already our ninth person you covered already, so I'll ask you a very quick final question before we go to lunch. Do you recall a moment or period in your career where you were just very lucky? Or is it just about hard work, smartness? Making an academic and brilliant academic career, or is there also the luck? If you want to share, what's there?
I think luck plays a role in the sense that, for instance, I think there are structural things which drew me into Heifers to read that book. And then there was the accident that Gary's book was on the shelf and I pulled it out. So I think that's a good illustration that you have to be someone who might be browsing in the economics section, even though it's not your field. But there's also luck. What do you find there? So, there's the luck of reading widely and being open to, you will be lucky if you put yourself in the position to be lucky. And I always, one of the great mentors in my life quotes, I think, some sportsman, maybe a very, very successful golf player or something, who says, the more I practice, the luckier I get. That was one example of luck, but there have been other examples of luck where, you put yourself in a place where good accidents might happen to you, and hopefully they will. So there's a component of luck, and I think that that's also something to remember when things go bad. When I send my PhD students off on the job market, or when I send my postdocs off on the job market, I say, look, it's a small appointments committee. We know small groups can do very accidental things. If you don't get the job, it's not because you're not good enough. It's because the accident didn't fall your way on the day. But that, I think, psychologically, it's really important to remain a happy person as an academic, which is not always easy,
Mhm.
especially when you're looking for a job, and staying happy. Maybe, you know, the accident, let yourself have a life which, which gives you accidental things that keep you happy, even when you're in an insecure part of your career. So open yourself to accidents that are outside academia, because they will feed into your production function. And being happy is an important part of your production function.
That's a very nice way
Yes.
to finish this.
Yeah.
Sheilagh, thank you so much for these insights on your research and
And-
some personal things. And
Thank
Yeah.
you for inviting me. I've really enjoyed my 2 days here. It's
been a
been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure for us too.
all right,